The dust came first as a smudge on the horizon, no bigger than a bruise on the sky, and by the time Louis Dawson understood what it truly was, it had already swallowed the sun whole. He had been riding for 2 days straight, his horse lathered and trembling beneath him, and he had sworn to himself somewhere around the Cimarron crossing that no wall of Texas dirt was going to be the thing that stopped him now. Not after everything. Not after 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days of waiting to make good on a promise he never should have broken. The wind hit him first, a hot, dry slap that smelled of copper and drought, and then the world turned the color of a rusted nail. Sand stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles, and his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Samson, screamed and tried to turn tail. Louis held the reins tight, pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, and leaned low over the animal's neck. "Not today," he said into the wind, though the wind ate his words before they had traveled a foot. "I made a promise and I aim to keep it, dust storm or no dust storm." Behind him, somewhere in Dodge City, Kansas, lay 2 years of his life he could never get back. Ahead of him, somewhere in the Texas panhandle town of Willow Creek, was a woman named Frances Graves, who by now might already be another man's wife. He kicked Samson forward into the roaring brown wall, and the storm swallowed him whole. The story of how Louis Dawson came to be riding blind through a panhandle dust storm in the spring of 1880 began 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1877, on a ranch just outside Willow Creek, Texas, where a 19-year-old woman named Frances Graves kept the books for her father's cattle operation and dreamed, in her quieter moments, of a life bigger than the flat brown horizon she had known her whole life. Frances was the only child of Thomas Graves, a widower who had built the Circle G ranch up from nothing after his wife died of fever when Frances was 6 years old. Thomas was a hard man, not cruel, but hardened the way a man gets when he has buried the only woman he ever loved and raised a daughter alone in a country that did not forgive weakness. He loved Frances fiercely, in the silent, stubborn way of men who do not know how to say such things aloud, and he wanted for her a life of security, which in his mind meant a marriage to a man of standing and land. Louis Dawson had none of those things. He was 22 years old, the third son of a failed cotton farmer from East Texas, and he had come west with nothing but a horse, a rope, and a willingness to work harder than any 2 men combined. Thomas Graves hired him as a ranch hand in the autumn of 1876, mostly because Louis had proven, during a hailstorm that spooked half the herd, that he could ride harder and think faster under pressure than men twice his age. It was Frances who first noticed him properly, not for his skill with cattle, though that was considerable, but for the way he spoke to the horses in the evening, low and gentle, as though they were old friends deserving of his patience. She had been sitting on the porch of the ranch house one October evening, shelling beans into a tin bowl, when she saw him lead a lame mare into the corral and spend nearly an hour just standing with her, murmuring, before he ever touched the injured leg. "You will wear that animal out with talking before you ever doctor her," Frances called out, not unkindly. Louis had looked up, startled, and then grinned in a way that made something in her chest turn over like a plowed field. "Some creatures need to trust you before they will let you help them, Miss Graves," he said. "Horses and people are not so different in that regard." "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am. I have found it to be true more often than not." She had laughed then, a real laugh, not the polite one she gave to the ranch hands her father brought around for supper, and Louis Dawson had carried the sound of that laugh with him for the rest of the winter like a coal kept warm in his pocket. Their courtship, such as it was, unfolded slowly over the following months, stolen in moments between chores and church socials and the long, quiet evenings when Thomas Graves rode out to check on distant fence lines and left the 2 of them, technically unchaperoned but always within sight of the bunkhouse, to talk on the porch about everything and nothing. Louis told her about his family's failed farm, about the shame of watching his father lose land his own grandfather had cleared, about his determination never to be a man who lost what he built. Frances told him about her mother, whom she barely remembered except as a smell of lavender and a voice singing hymns, and about her fear that her father would marry her off to some rancher's son, the way one traded a good mare for a better bull. "I will not be traded," she told him once fiercely, on an evening in early spring when the bluebonnets had just begun to carpet the hills around Willow Creek. "Whatever else happens to me, Louis Dawson, I intend to choose my own husband." "Then choose wisely," he had said, only half joking. "I intend to." It was on that same evening, with the bluebonnets glowing pale blue in the dusk and the smell of dust and wildflowers thick in the air, that Louis Dawson first kissed Frances Graves, quickly and clumsily, and then apologized so thoroughly that she had to kiss him a second time just to make him stop talking. By the time summer came, they were secretly, hopelessly, entirely in love, the kind of love that young people feel as an absolute certainty, unshadowed yet by the compromises and cruelties of the world. They spoke, in whispers on the porch, of a future together. Louis had a plan, the same plan half the young men in Texas had that year. He would join a cattle drive north along the Western Trail to the railhead at Dodge City, Kansas, where a good hand could earn $30 a month plus a bonus at trail's end, more money than he could make in a year working fences for Thomas Graves. With that money, he told her, he could buy a small parcel of land, enough for a modest herd of his own, and come back to Willow Creek, a man worth marrying in her father's eyes. "I will be gone 4 months, maybe 5, he told her one night in April of 1877, holding both her hands in his on the dark porch. "But I will come back, Frances. I swear it on my mother's grave. I will come back before the first snow, and I will speak to your father properly, and I will marry you if you will still have me. I will always have you," she said, and she meant it with the whole unbroken certainty of 19 years old. "But you must promise me something else. Anything. Promise me you will write, even just a line, whenever you can find a way to send it. I do not think I can bear the not knowing." "I promise," Louis said, and he had meant it as fully as any promise he had ever made in his life. "Whatever happens, Frances, I will find a way to get word to you. And I will come back through fire and flood, and anything else this country throws at me, and I will keep my word." He left with the trail drive 2 weeks later, one of 14 hands pushing nearly 2,000 head of longhorn cattle north out of the Willow Creek country, up along the Western Trail toward the railhead towns of Kansas. Frances stood at the edge of the Circle G's north pasture and watched the dust cloud of the herd shrink into the horizon until she could no longer tell which speck of moving dust was Louis and which was simply Texas, blowing away as it always did. She did not know, that April morning, that it would be nearly 3 years before she saw him again, nor did she know the strange and terrible chain of events that would keep him from her, nor that a promise made with such simple faith would become the most painful and most defining thread of both their lives. The cattle drive itself went well enough for the first 6 weeks. Louis proved himself capable, quick with a rope, steady in a crisis, and well liked by the trail boss, a grizzled man named Amos Whitfield who had driven cattle north every year since the end of the war. Louis wrote to Frances twice in those early weeks, brief letters scratched by lamplight and handed to freight wagons or passing riders headed south, full of small details he thought might make her smile. A coyote that had stolen a cook's bacon, the way the stars looked different this far north, how much he missed the sound of her laugh. The trouble began in early June, somewhere along the Cimarron River in the Indian Territory, when the herd was struck by a night stampede during a violent thunderstorm. Cattle scattered for miles in every direction, and in the chaos and dark, nearly 300 head were never recovered, along with a strongbox containing the trail outfit's payroll money, which had been lashed to the chuck wagon and was somehow lost in the confusion, either stolen in the panic or buried somewhere in the churned mud. No one could say for certain. What was certain, in the eyes of the outfit's owner, a hard and suspicious cattleman named Colonel Ezra Pratt, who rode up from Texas. Once word reached him of the loss was that someone among the trail hands had stolen the payroll box during the confusion of the stampede. And because Louis Dawson had been on night herd duty in the exact section of the drive where the strongbox disappeared, and because he was young and poor and had no family name to vouch for him, suspicion fell heaviest upon him. It did not matter that Amos Whitfield himself argued on Louis's behalf, insisting the boy had ridden half the night trying to turn the stampeding herd and could not possibly have had time to steal and hide a heavy strongbox in the dark. Colonel Pratt was a man used to being obeyed, and he had Louis arrested by the county sheriff when the drive reached Dodge City in July, on the strength of nothing more than proximity and poverty. Louis spent the better part of that summer and autumn in a Dodge City jail cell, awaiting a trial that kept being postponed for lack of a traveling circuit judge, protesting his innocence to anyone who would listen, which in a frontier jail was almost no one. He wrote to Francis as often as he was permitted paper and ink, desperate letters explaining what had happened, begging her to believe him, promising that as soon as the truth came out, he would return to her exactly as he had sworn. Not one of those letters ever reached the Circle G ranch. This was not, as Louis would spend months fearing, because Francis had stopped caring. It was because Thomas Graves, who had never fully approved of a penniless ranch hand courting his only daughter, happened to be in Dodge City himself that autumn, selling a separate herd of his own, when he heard talk in a saloon of a Texas cowhand named Dawson jailed for stealing a trail outfit's payroll. Thomas made inquiries, confirmed the name, and made a decision that he told himself in the moment was an act of mercy toward his daughter rather than the cruelty it truly was. He intercepted every letter Louis sent addressed to Francis Graves at the Willow Creek post office, paying the postmaster, an old acquaintance, a few coins to hand the letters directly to him instead. He burned each one, unopened, in the stove of his own kitchen, and he told his daughter nothing at all, allowing the silence itself to do the work of ending a courtship he had never wanted. He is a thief, and worse, a liar, Thomas told himself, though in his heart he was not entirely certain Louis Dawson was guilty of anything but bad luck. Better she believe him unfaithful than know she loved a man in irons. It was, Thomas would later admit through hard tears of his own, the worst injustice he ever committed against the daughter he loved more than his own life, and one he would spend years trying to atone for. Francis, knowing nothing of the burned letters, waited through that first summer with the patient hope of a woman in love. When August came and went without word, she told herself the trail had simply been longer and harder than expected. When September brought the first cool evenings and still no letter, she began to lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her small room, running through every possible reason for his silence that did not involve him having simply changed his mind about her. By October, when the first frost silvered the buffalo grass around Willow Creek and Louis had promised to be home before the first snow, Francis stopped checking the post office every day and began checking only once a week, because the disappointment had become a physical ache she could not sustain daily. By December, when snow did fall, thin and dry across the panhandle, and still no word had come from Louis Dawson, something in Francis Graves that had been bright and hopeful began slowly to go quiet and gray, like a fire banked down to embers. She never learned in all that time that Louis was 200 miles north in a Dodge City jail cell, writing to her every single week, wondering with growing despair why she never wrote back, and slowly, painfully, beginning to believe that perhaps her father had been right about him all along, that a penniless drifter had no business hoping for a woman like Francis Graves, and that her silence was simply her way of telling him the truth as gently as she could manage. Louis's trial finally took place in February of 1878, nearly 8 months after his arrest. The circuit judge, a tired, fair-minded man named Judge Harmon Cole, listened to the evidence, which amounted to nothing more than Louis's proximity to the stampede and Colonel Pratt's insistence that someone must be punished for the loss. Amos Whitfield testified on Louis's behalf, as did two other trail hands who swore Louis had been in their sight through most of the chaotic night. In the end, Judge Cole dismissed the charges for lack of evidence, noting dryly that Colonel Pratt seemed more interested in recovering his pride than his payroll. Louis walked out of that Dodge City courthouse in February of 1878 a free man, but not a whole one. 8 months in a jail cell, 8 months of unanswered letters, 8 months of believing himself abandoned by the only woman he had ever loved, had hollowed something out of him. He had no money, having spent what little he had on paper and postage, and the small bribes required to keep a lawyer's minimal attention. He was, in the eyes of half of Dodge City, still the cowhand who had probably stolen a payroll and simply been clever enough to hide it well, a reputation that followed him even after his legal exoneration and made honest work hard to find. He told himself, in the bitter weeks after his release, that returning to Willow Creek was pointless. Frances had not written in 8 months. Whatever she had once felt for him had clearly withered, and he could not blame her for it. A woman deserved better than a man who disappeared into silence and scandal. He told himself he would stay in Kansas, find work, rebuild what he could of his name and his savings, and let the memory of Frances Graves become simply that, a memory, a sweetness from a life he no longer had a claim to. It was easier in some ways to believe this than to face the alternative, which was riding 200 miles south only to be turned away at her father's door. And so Louis Dawson stayed in Kansas for nearly 2 more years, working as a ranch hand outside Dodge City, then as a hired gun protecting cattle drives from rustlers, slowly rebuilding a small nest of savings and a reputation as an honest, hard-working man. He did not write to Frances again after that first year of silence. Pride and heartbreak in equal measure kept his hand from the pen. He told himself he had let her go. But he never, not once in all that time, stopped thinking of her laugh on that porch, or the bluebonnets in the dusk, or the promise he had made on his mother's grave. Back in Willow Creek, Frances Graves had built her own kind of quiet endurance around the wound Louis's silence had left in her. She continued to keep her father's ranch books, continued to run the household since her mother's death had left no one else to do it, and slowly, over the 2 years that followed, allowed herself to believe the story her father had never had to tell her outright, because her own silence had told it for him. That Louis Dawson had simply found another life, another woman perhaps, somewhere north of the Red River, and had not cared enough to send even a single word of explanation. It was a lie built on ashes she never saw burning, but it hurt exactly as much as the truth would have, and in some ways more, because there was no reason to attach to it, nothing to forgive, only a great gray absence where her hope had once lived. In the autumn of 1879, when Frances was 22 years old, her father began, with increasing insistence, to encourage the attentions of a young rancher named Randall Pierce, whose family owned a spread 3 times the size of the Circle G to the south. Randall was not a cruel man, nor even an unkind one. He was simply ordinary, a solid, unremarkable young man of good prospects who wanted a capable wife and had decided, with the same practical calculation he applied to buying cattle, that Frances Graves would suit his needs admirably. "He would provide well for you," Thomas told his daughter one evening, not quite able to meet her eyes as he said it, the weight of his own long-ago deception pressing on him more heavily each year. "You would want for nothing, Frances, land, security, a good name. I do not love him, Papa." "Love," Thomas said, and there was something almost pained in the word, "is a luxury this country does not always allow us to keep." Frances, who had loved once with her whole unguarded heart and had it apparently thrown back at her in silence, found she had little strength left to argue the point. By the spring of 1880, worn down by her father's gentle, relentless pressure, and by her own exhausted belief that the great love of her life had simply chosen to forget her, Frances Graves agreed to marry Randall Pierce. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in April, to be held at the small Willow Creek Church, with the reception to follow at the Pierce family ranch. She told herself in the days leading up to the wedding that she was doing the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing her mother would have wanted for her had she lived to offer counsel. She told herself this while pressing her wedding dress, a plain but well-made gown of cream cotton that her aunt had sewn for her, and she told herself this while lying awake at night listening to the wind moving through the cottonwoods outside her window, and she almost believed it. 200 miles north, in the last week of March, 1880, Louis Dawson sat in a Dodge City saloon nursing a glass of whiskey he had not touched in 20 minutes, listening to a trail hand he barely knew tell a story about a wedding down in the Panhandle country. Graves' girl, out of Willow Creek. The man was saying to no one in particular, the way men talk in saloons when they have had one drink too many and a story burning to get out. Marrying into the Pierce Ranch. Big spread down south of there, whole counties talking about it. Louis's whole body went cold and still. Graves, he said before he could stop himself. Frances Graves, the trail hand squinted at him. That her name? Something like that, you know her. I did, Louis said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. A long time ago. He did not sleep that night. He lay on his narrow cot in the boarding house where he had rented a room for 3 years, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, and he let himself, for the first time in 2 years, truly ask the question he had been too afraid to ask. What if she never received his letters at all? It was a thought that should have occurred to him long before, but grief and pride are strange companions, and they had kept him from examining his own certainty too closely. Now, lying awake with the news of her impending marriage burning in his chest, he forced himself to think it through properly. He had written to her nearly every week for 8 months from that Dodge City jail. Not one reply had come. Was it truly so easy to believe that Frances Graves, who had held his hands on a dark porch and sworn she would always have him, had simply stopped caring within a matter of weeks, without a single word of explanation, without even the small cruelty of a letter telling him it was over? Or was it more likely that something, somewhere between his pen and her hands, had gone terribly wrong? He thought of her father, of the cool, assessing way Thomas Graves had always looked at him, the poor ranch hand courting his only daughter. He thought of how Thomas had happened to be in Dodge City himself, that same summer, selling cattle. A terrible, cold certainty began to settle into Louis's chest, and once it had settled, he found he could not sleep another minute. By dawn, he had made his decision. He did not know for certain what had happened to his letters, could not prove Thomas Graves had done anything at all, but he knew, with a clarity that felt like the first true thing he had understood in 2 years, that he could not let Frances Graves marry another man believing a lie, not without at least trying to tell her the truth himself, face to face, one final time. If she heard him out and still chose Randall Pierce, so be it. He would accept that as a man ought to accept the consequences of his own long silence. But he would not let her walk into that church believing he had simply stopped loving her, when the truth was he had never, not for one single day in 2 years, stopped. The wedding was 8 days away. Willow Creek was 200 miles south. Louis had a fair horse, 3 years of hard-earned savings, and nothing left to lose. He rode out of Dodge City that same morning, pushing Sampson hard south along the same trails he had once driven cattle north upon, retracing 3 years of his life in reverse, as though he might somehow ride backward through time itself and arrive before the damage had been done. The first 3 days passed in a blur of hard riding and short, restless sleep, snatched in whatever shelter he could find, a lined shack, a stand of cottonwoods, once simply the lee side of a low bluff. He rationed his water carefully, bought grain for Sampson whenever he passed a homestead willing to sell, and pushed south with a single-minded desperation that surprised even himself. He had thought, in the 2 years since Dodge City, that the sharpest edges of his love for Frances had dulled into something more like a scar, healed over and manageable. He learned now, riding hard through the Panhandle spring, that he had been wrong. The wound had simply been waiting, and now that hope had been let back in. It ached exactly as fiercely as it had the day he rode away from her in 1877. On the morning of the fourth day, with perhaps 60 miles left between him and Willow Creek, Louis noticed the sky beginning to change. He had lived enough of his life on the plains to know the signs. The wind, which had been blowing steady from the southwest for 2 days, suddenly shifted and stilled, an unnatural quiet settling over the grassland that made the hair on his arms stand up. The light took on a strange yellow-brown cast, and far to the northwest, along the horizon he had just come from, a dark line was building, low and wide, stretching from one edge of the world to the other. A local rancher, an older man named Silas Boone, whom Louis had stopped to buy grain from that same morning, stood beside him on the porch of his sod house, shielding his eyes against the strange light, and shook his head grimly. "That there is a duster," Silas said. "Big one, too, by the look of it. You would do well to hole up here till it passes, son. Seen men lose their way not 100 yards from their own front door in a storm like that one is fixing to be." "I cannot," Louis said. "I have to reach Willow Creek before Saturday." Silas studied him for a long moment, the particular look of an old man measuring the desperation of a young one. "Woman?" he asked finally. "Yes, sir." "Worth dying in a dust storm over." Louis thought of Frances Graves standing at the edge of the north pasture, of her laugh on the porch, of bluebonnets in the dusk, and a promise sworn on his mother's grave that he had broken through no true fault of his own but had broken all the same. "Yes, sir," he said. "She is." Silas Boone sighed, the sigh of a man who had seen enough young fools in his life to recognize another one, and went into his soddy, returning a moment later with a length of rope and a wet bandana. "Tie this rope from your saddle horn to your wrist," he instructed. "If you get thrown or your horse bolts out from under you, you do not want to lose him in that mess, not out here. And keep this bandana wet as you can and over your nose and mouth, else the dust will fill your lungs faster than you would believe. Follow the fence lines where you can find them, and if the wind gets too fierce to see your horse's ears, you get down and you dig in low against whatever cover you can find and you wait. Do not try to push through the worst of it blind. That is how men die out here. Thank you, Mr. Boone. Do not thank me, son. Thank me by living to marry your girl." Louis mounted Samson, tied the rope as instructed, wet the bandana in the rancher's water trough and tied it over his lower face, and rode south into the gathering dark, the great brown wall of dust rolling closer behind him with every passing hour, like some vast and hungry animal chasing him down. For the first several hours, he managed to stay ahead of the worst of it, riding hard along a wagon road that roughly paralleled the route he remembered toward Willow Creek. But dust storms on the Texas plains do not simply chase a rider from one direction. They engulf the whole world at once, rolling and boiling in on every side, and by mid-afternoon the light around him had gone the color of old rust, and grit had begun to sting his exposed skin even through his shirt sleeves. By the time the true wall of the storm overtook him, visibility had already dropped to less than 100 yards, the sun reduced to a dim orange smear directly overhead, as though seen through smoked glass. Louis pulled his hat low, wet his bandana again from the canteen, and pressed on, following what he prayed was still the wagon road beneath him, though he could no longer see more than a few feet past Samson's straining ears. The storm's full fury arrived an hour later, and it was unlike anything Louis had experienced in 3 years of working cattle across the plains. The wind screamed, a physical force that nearly tore him from the saddle, and the dust came not as a haze but as a solid, choking wall that turned midday into something darker than any night he had ever ridden through. He could not see his own hand held a foot from his face. He could not tell up from down, could not have said with any certainty which direction was south, and which was the way he had come. Samson stumbled, terrified, and only the rope tied fast between Louis's wrist and the saddle horn kept them together when the horse finally reared and threw him hard into what felt like a shallow ditch beside the road. Louis lay there for a long moment, the wind screaming above him, dirt filling his ears and the creases of his clothes, and he thought, with a strange, dust-choked clarity, of Francis Graves's face the last time he had seen it, turned up to his in the porch dark, full of trust he had not yet learned to doubt himself worthy of. "I am not dying in a ditch 2 days from you," he said aloud, though the words were torn away instantly by the wind, and he forced himself up onto his hands and knees, found the rope still fast to his wrist, and hauled himself hand over hand along its length until he found Samson, trembling but upright, pressed low against the meager shelter of a fence post and a scraggled mesquite. Remembering Silas Boone's advice, Louis did not try to remount and push blindly forward. Instead, he worked his way along the fence line by touch alone, one hand always on the wire, leading Samson behind him, until he found a shallow wash cut into the prairie by some long dry creek, offering just enough of a lip of earth to break the worst of the wind. He pressed himself and the horse into that shelter, wrapped his slicker around both their heads as best he could, and waited out the worst hours of the storm in a howling brown darkness that seemed, at moments, like the end of the world itself. He thought, in those long hours crouched in the dust with the wind screaming above him, of everything he had lost and everything he still hoped to reclaim. He thought of the 8 months of unanswered letters, and for the first time allowed himself to grieve properly, not for his own suffering in that Dodge City jail, but for what Francis must have suffered too, waiting, wondering, slowly convincing herself she had been abandoned by a man who in truth had never stopped loving her for a single day. He thought of Thomas Graves, and felt, strangely, not only anger but a kind of aching pity, imagining the older man carrying the weight of a lie for 3 years, watching his daughter's light dim and knowing himself to be the cause. Mostly he thought of Francis, and he made himself a second promise there in the dust and the dark, quieter than the first but no less fierce, that if he lived through this storm, if he reached Willow Creek in time, he would spend the rest of his life proving to her, every single day, that his love had never wavered, whatever silence had come between them. The storm began to weaken in the late afternoon, the howling wind dropping first to a moan, and then to a steady, gritty breeze, the light slowly shifting from rust-brown back toward something like ordinary daylight, pale and hazy but real. Louis emerged from the wash-coated head to foot in fine yellow dust, his eyes red-rimmed and streaming, his lungs aching with every breath, but alive, and so was Samson, though the horse's flanks trembled with exhaustion and fear. He mounted up as soon as the visibility allowed safe travel, and rode on through the settling dust into the evening, following the fence line until it joined again with the main wagon road, and pressing on through the night by the light of a moon still hazy behind the last thin veils of airborne dirt. He reached the outskirts of Willow Creek on the morning of the 8th day, 2 days before the wedding was set to take place, exhausted, filthy, his clothes torn and his face burned raw by wind and grit, looking less like a hopeful suitor than a man who had crawled out of the earth itself. The town had changed little in 3 years. The same general store stood on the corner of the main street, the same small white church with its modest steeple, the same water tower rising above the rail spur that had been extended to Willow Creek only the year before, connecting the small panhandle town at last to the wider railroad network. Louis rode Samson slowly down the main street, drawing curious stares from townsfolk who did not recognize the dust-caked stranger, until he reached the edge of town and turned his horse north, toward the Circle G Ranch, toward Francis. He stopped at the top of the last rise before the ranch house came into view, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. And for a long moment he simply sat there on his exhausted horse, looking down at the house where he had once courted a 19-year-old girl on a dark porch, and where that same girl, now a grown woman of 22, was 2 days away from marrying someone else. No sense sitting here, he told himself, and nudged Samson forward down the slope. Frances Graves was in the kitchen garden behind the ranch house that morning, cutting the last of the season's early greens for supper, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching at a walk up the front drive. She was not expecting anyone. Her father had ridden out to the south pasture at dawn, and the wedding preparations, while all-consuming in the abstract, did not typically involve unannounced visitors on a Thursday morning. She set down her basket and walked around the side of the house, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron, and stopped dead in the yard when she saw the rider dismounting near the porch. He was thinner than she remembered and dust-caked from head to boot, his clothes torn in places, his face burned and wind-chapped, but there was no mistaking the set of his shoulders or the particular way he moved, careful and deliberate even in exhaustion, like a man who had learned young to conserve his strength for when it truly mattered. "Louis," she said, and the name came out of her as barely more than a breath. He turned at the sound of her voice, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply stood there in the ranch yard staring at each other across 3 years of silence and grief and misunderstanding, as though neither could quite believe the other was real. "Frances," he said finally, and his voice cracked on her name. "I know I have no right to be standing here. I know that. But I could not let you marry another man without at least telling you the truth." Something hard and protective closed over her expression, a wall built brick by brick over 3 years of believing herself abandoned. "The truth," she repeated, and there was an edge in her voice now, sharp with old pain. "You disappeared, Louis, for 3 years. Not one letter, not one word, and now you ride in 2 days before my wedding covered in dust like some ghost, and you want to speak to me of truth." "I wrote to you every week for 8 months, Louis said, and he stepped closer, though he stopped himself a respectful distance away, close enough to speak plainly but far enough not to crowd her. "I was arrested outside Dodge City that summer, wrongly accused of stealing our trail outfit's payroll after a stampede. I sat in a jail cell for 8 months waiting for a trial, and I wrote you every single one of those weeks, Frances. I swear it before God, and I never once received a single word back." Frances stared at him, her chest rising and falling too quickly, old grief and fresh confusion warring plainly across her features. "That cannot be true. I never received any letters. I would have written back 100 times over if I had known." "I believe you," Louis said quietly. "I did not for a long time. I let myself believe you had simply stopped caring, because it was easier than believing something worse had happened. But 2 weeks ago I heard talk in a Dodge City saloon of your coming wedding, and I could not stop thinking of it, could not stop wondering how a woman who once swore she would always have me could go 3 years without a single letter, unless something had gone wrong that had nothing to do with her heart at all." "What are you saying, Louis?" Before he could answer, the sound of another horse's hooves came up the drive, and both of them turned to see Thomas Graves riding in from the south pasture, his face going pale, and then hard as granite the moment he recognized the dust-caked stranger standing in his yard. "Dawson," Thomas said, dismounting slowly, his hand resting, whether consciously or not, near the pistol at his hip. "You have a great deal of nerve showing your face on this ranch." "Papa," Frances said, "he says he wrote to me every week for 8 months while he was wrongly jailed in Dodge City over a stolen payroll he had nothing to do with. He says he never received a single reply." Something in Thomas Graves's face shifted then, a flicker of guilt so plain and so sudden that Frances saw it immediately, and her breath caught in her throat. "Papa," she said again, slower this time, dread creeping into her voice. "You were in Dodge City that summer. You told me so yourself when you came home in the autumn." Thomas Graves stood very still in his own ranch yard, an old man suddenly, the weight of 3 years of silence pressing down on him all at once, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out low and broken in a way his daughter had never heard from him before. "I heard talk in a saloon," he said, "of a cowhand named Dawson jailed for theft. I made inquiries and confirmed it was him. I told myself I was protecting you, Francis, from loving a man who might have been a thief, who at the very least had brought scandal onto his own name. I paid the postmaster to hand me his letters instead of delivering them to you. I burned every single one, unopened, in the kitchen stove." The silence that followed was total, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the dry whisper of wind through the cottonwoods along the creek. Frances stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, 3 years of grief and confusion and slowly hardened acceptance crumbling all at once into a single, unbearable realization that the love she had believed abandoned had, in fact, never wavered at all, and that the silence which had broken her heart had been manufactured by her own father's hand. "How could you?" she whispered finally, tears spilling freely down her dust-streaked face. "How could you do that to me, Papa? To him?" "I was wrong," Thomas said, and his own voice broke now, the hardness gone out of him entirely, leaving only an old man's shame. "I have known I was wrong for 3 years, Francis. I have carried it every single day, watching the light go out of you a little more each season, telling myself it was too late to confess, that the damage was already done and confession would only add cruelty to cruelty. I told myself I was protecting you from a scandal. In truth, I think I was protecting myself from admitting I had judged a good man unfairly and cost my own daughter her happiness in the doing of it." "He was exonerated," Louis said quietly. "The judge dismissed every charge in February of 1878. There was never any evidence against me at all, only Colonel Pratt's need to blame someone for his own losses." Thomas Graves looked at Louis Dawson for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion in his face, the dust still caked in the creases of his neck, the desperate hope still visible beneath 3 years of hardship. "You rode through that dust storm," he said finally. "The one that came through 2 days back. You rode through that to get here before the wedding." "Yes, sir, I did." "Why?" "Because I promised Francis 3 years ago that I would come back through fire and flood and anything else this country threw at me, and I would keep my word," Louis said, and his voice, though hoarse and cracked with dust and exhaustion, did not waver. "I broke that promise once, though God knows it was never truly my choice to break it. I was not about to let a little wind and dirt be the reason I broke it twice." Francis made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and crossed the distance between them before either man could say another word, throwing her arms around Louis's dust-caked neck and burying her face against his shoulder, as 3 years of grief finally broke loose all at once. Louis wrapped his arms around her, holding on as though he might never let go again, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, simply stood together in the ranch yard while Thomas Graves looked on, his own eyes wet with tears he made no effort to hide. "I am so sorry," Louis murmured into her hair. "I should have come south the moment I was freed. I let my own hurt and pride convince me you had simply stopped loving me, and I let 2 more years pass in silence when I should have ridden down here and demanded the truth from your own lips." "We were both fools," Francis said, pulling back just enough to look up into his face, her hands still fisted in the dusty fabric of his shirt as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. "But you are here now. You rode through a dust storm to be here now." "I would ride through 100 of them," Louis said, "if it meant one more chance to keep my promise to you." It was Thomas Graves who finally broke the moment, clearing his throat roughly and looking away toward the horizon, though his voice, when he spoke, was gentler than either of them had heard from him in years. "There is the small matter," he said, "of a wedding planned for Saturday, to a young man who has done nothing wrong in this except perhaps ask for a wife whose heart was never truly free to give." Frances turned to face her father, still keeping one hand tightly laced with Louis's, her chin lifting in a way that reminded Thomas suddenly and sharply of her mother. "I will speak with Randall myself, Papa." He deserves the truth, plainly told, and I will give it to him with all the gentleness I can manage, but I will not marry him. Not when the man I have loved since I was 19 years old just rode through a dust storm to keep a promise you kept from me for 3 years. That is not a debt I can repay by marrying someone else out of obligation." Thomas Graves looked at his daughter for a long moment, then at Louis Dawson standing beside her, dust-caked and exhausted but steady, his eyes never leaving Francis's face, and something in the old rancher's chest finally eased, a weight he had carried for 3 years beginning, at last, to lift. "Then I suppose," Thomas said slowly, "I owe you an apology as well, Dawson, and perhaps something more practical than words alone. Come inside. You look like a man who has not eaten a proper meal in a week, nor slept in one either. We will speak of Randall Pierce and of weddings tomorrow. Today you will wash the dust off and eat and rest, and Frances will decide for herself what happens next without any more interference from her father." That evening, once Louis had washed and eaten and slept for several hours in the same bunkhouse he had once called home, Frances found him sitting alone on the porch steps in the last light of dusk, much as he had sat there 3 years before, and she settled beside him without a word, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I have to tell Randall tomorrow," she said quietly. "It will not be an easy conversation. He has done nothing wrong, and I have let this go on longer than I should have, telling myself it was the sensible thing to do." "I know," Louis said. "I am sorry to be the cause of that hurt, even unintentionally." "You are not the cause of it," Frances said firmly. "My father's lie is the cause of it. I only wish I had trusted my own heart enough these past years to question the silence more than I did. I told myself so many stories about why you might have stopped loving me, and none of them, not one, was the truth." "We cannot get those years back," Louis said, "but I intend to spend every year going forward making up for them if you will let me." Frances turned to look at him in the fading light, taking in the changes 3 hard years had carved into his face, the new steadiness in his eyes that had not been there at 19, the way he still, even now, looked at her as though she were the only fixed point in an uncertain world. "Ask me properly then," she said softly. "Not the way you did at 19, all breathless promises on a porch. Ask me now, knowing everything we have been through." Louis Dawson slid off the porch step and knelt in the dirt of the yard, taking both her hands in his, dust still faintly ground into the creases of his own weathered palms. "Frances Graves," he said, his voice steady now despite the exhaustion still heavy in his bones, "I loved you when I was 22 years old and had nothing to offer you but a promise. I have spent 3 years learning what that promise truly cost, both of us, and I have ridden through storm and dust and 200 miles of hard country to ask you this properly, with nothing hidden between us anymore. Will you marry me? Not because your father wills it, not because it is sensible or safe, but because I love you more now, knowing everything that has passed, than I ever did as a boy who did not yet understand what love truly demands of a person." "Yes," Frances said before he had even finished speaking, tears bright in her eyes in the last gray light of dusk. "Yes, Louis Dawson, I will marry you." The conversation with Randall Pierce took place the following morning, and though it was every bit as difficult as Frances had feared, it was conducted with honesty and respect on both sides. Randall, to his credit, listened to the whole story without interruption, his jaw tightening at the mention of the intercepted letters, and when Frances finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment before finally nodding. "I cannot say I am not disappointed," he said. "I had thought we might have built a good, steady life together. But I will not stand in the way of a love that survived a dust storm and 3 years of injustice to find its way back. You deserve that, Frances, whatever else might have been between us. Thank you, Randall, truly. You deserve someone whose whole heart is free to give, and I am sorry it could not be mine." The Pierce family, though initially embarrassed by the broken engagement, ultimately took the news with more grace than Thomas Graves had feared, and within the year Randall Pierce himself would marry a young schoolteacher newly arrived from Missouri, a match that suited him by all accounts, far better than the one that had nearly been. Thomas Graves spent the weeks that followed making his own quiet amends, first by writing a long, honest letter to Colonel Ezra Pratt demanding a public retraction of the theft accusations against Louis Dawson, which Pratt, embarrassed by the scrutiny, eventually provided in the form of a printed notice in the Dodge City newspaper clearing Louis's name entirely. Thomas also insisted on gifting the young couple 40 acres of Circle G land along the creek as a wedding present, land good enough for a modest herd of their own, the very kind of foundation Louis had once ridden north hoping to earn through a cattle drive that had instead cost him 3 years of his life. "It is not enough to undo what I did," Thomas told Louis plainly, the two of them standing together at the edge of that new land one evening in early April. "But it is what I have to offer, and I hope you will accept it in the spirit it is given, as an old man's attempt to make right what he broke." "I accept it," Louis said, "not because it settles the debt, Mr. Graves, but because I understand now what it costs a man to admit he was wrong. And I would rather build something new with you than carry old grievances into the family I am hoping to start." Thomas Graves, not a man given easily to displays of emotion, gripped Louis's hand firmly at that, and something between them settled into a rough but genuine peace that would, over the years that followed, grow into real affection. Louis and Frances were married on the last Saturday of April, 1880, in the same small white church in Willow Creek, where Frances's wedding to Randall Pierce had once been planned, though the guest list and the groom had both changed considerably in the intervening weeks. The dust storms of early spring had finally passed, and the day dawned clear and warm, the bluebonnets blooming thick and blue across the hills exactly as they had on the evening, 3 years before, when Louis had first kissed Frances Graves on her father's porch. Frances wore the same cream cotton dress her aunt had sewn for the wedding that never was, altered slightly and pressed fresh for the occasion, and when she walked down the short aisle of the Willow Creek Church on her father's arm, she found Louis Dawson waiting for her at the altar, cleaned up and properly dressed for the first time since his arrival, his eyes bright with a happiness that no amount of dust or hardship had managed to permanently dim. "I, Louis Dawson, take thee, Frances Graves," he said, his voice steady and clear, "to be my wedded wife, through drought and flood, through dust storm and clear sky, for as long as we both shall live, and I promise before God and this whole town that this is one promise I do not intend to break, not ever again." The small congregation laughed softly at that, understanding the reference, and Frances, laughing through happy tears, made her own vows in turn, and the two of them were pronounced husband and wife to the sound of genuine, warm applause from a town that had, over the preceding weeks, come to know the whole remarkable story of a promise broken by injustice and mended by a man's desperate ride through a panhandle dust storm. They built their home on the 40 acres Thomas Graves had gifted them, a modest but sturdy house of hewn cottonwood and limestone, with a porch facing west so they could watch the sunset together every evening, the way they once had as young lovers with far less certainty about the future than they now carried. Louis worked the small herd of cattle he purchased with his hard-earned Kansas savings, supplemented by a few head Thomas gave them as a wedding gift of his own, and within 2 years, the Dawson Ranch had grown into a modest but respectable operation in its own right, known throughout the county for the quality of its stock and the evident happiness of the couple who ran it. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after his grandfather, in a gesture of forgiveness that moved the old rancher to tears, was born in the spring of 1881, exactly 1 year after that dust storm had nearly kept Louis from reaching Willow Creek in time. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, whom they named Sarah after Louis's own mother, on whose grave he had first sworn his broken and then mended promise. A third child, another son named Silas after the old rancher who had given Louis the rope and the wet bandana that likely saved his life in that storm, arrived in 1886, completing a family that Francis often said felt like a small miracle stitched together from every hardship that had nearly kept it from existing at all. Thomas Graves lived to see all three grandchildren grow into sturdy, laughing children, and in his later years he became a frequent and welcome presence at the Dawson Ranch, often found teaching young Thomas to ride or telling Sarah stories about her grandmother, whom she had never known, but whose lavender scent and hymn-singing voice lived on in the old man's fond, careful memories. He never fully forgave himself for the 3 years of pain his lie had caused, but he spent every year that followed trying to earn back the trust he had broken, and by the time he passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1895, surrounded by his daughter, her husband, and their 3 children, he did so with the quiet knowledge that whatever wrong he had done, he had spent the remainder of his days working honestly to make right. Louis and Francis Dawson grew old together on that Panhandle ranch, weathering droughts and hard winters and the ordinary trials of frontier life, with the same steady partnership that had first drawn them together as a young ranch hand and rancher's daughter watching horses in an autumn corral. They told the story of the dust storm often, to their children and later their grandchildren, not as a tale of tragedy, but as a testament to what a promise truly meant when a person was willing to ride through fire and dust, and 200 hard miles to keep it. On quiet evenings, when the work was done, and the children grown and gone to build their own lives across the Panhandle, Louis and Francis still sat together on that west-facing porch, watching the sun sink into the flat horizon exactly as they had as young lovers so many years before, and Louis would sometimes take her hand, weathered now by decades of ranch work and mothering, and a life fully and richly lived, and say the same words he had said kneeling in the dirt of her father's yard in 1880. "I would ride through 100 dust storms," he would say, "for one more evening like this one." "You already did," Francis would answer every time, with the same soft laugh that had first turned something over in his chest on an October evening long ago. "And I have loved you for every single one of the years since." The wind moved gently through the cottonwoods along the creek, carrying with it the faint, sweet smell of bluebonnets blooming once more across the Willow Creek hills, and the two of them sat together in the fading light, a promise kept at last, and kept for the rest of their lives.